She was told she was too ugly to be seen in daylight, and by sundown the town had already decided she didn't deserve a name. Evelyn Hart stepped off a creaking wagon into Red Hollow with a black widow's veil pulled low over her face, the kind of veil that swallowed identity before it ever reached a mouth. The late afternoon wind rolled through the street like dry smoke, lifting dust from the wooden planks and dragging it across her boots, as if the town itself was trying to erase her footprints. No one greeted her. No one needed to. In Red Hollow, silence was faster than speech, and judgment always arrived first. Outside Miller's general store, a bell rang when she pushed the door open, sharp and unnecessary, and every conversation inside died at once like a fire starved of air. A man near the counter looked at her, then away, as though holding her gaze too long might stain something invisible on his skin. Evelyn did not speak. She simply held out a few coins and asked for bread, her voice soft but steady, carrying the tired weight of a long journey across empty roads and longer nights. The clerk hesitated, then slid the coins back across the wood without counting them, refusing her without explanation, as if her presence alone invalidated currency itself. Outside, leaning against a post half in shadow, stood Jack Rourke, a man who looked like he had never stayed anywhere long enough to be welcomed or rejected properly. A worn coat hung loose on his shoulders, and a silver watch rested against his chest, catching fragments of light whenever he shifted slightly. He had not spoken since she arrived, and he did not speak now. He only watched. Not her face, not her veil, but the way the town reacted to her like instinct rather than choice. Evelyn stepped back into the street, holding nothing, her hands empty but not trembling, though every eye she passed seemed to weigh more than stone. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and was pulled away without a word. A woman at the well turned her back before Evelyn was even close enough to ask for water. It was not cruelty that filled the air, not loudly at least, but something quieter, more practiced, something that had been rehearsed for years until it no longer needed permission. Jack finally moved when Evelyn stopped near the edge of the boardwalk, her shoulders still, her head slightly lowered, as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. He walked past her without looking directly at her face, then placed a small handful of coins on the same counter that had just refused her, as though correcting an error the town refused to acknowledge. The storekeeper said nothing. No one did. But something shifted in the way the air settled, as if Red Hollow had just realized it might not understand what it was looking at. And Jack Rourke, still silent, kept watching like a man waiting for a truth the town was not ready to name. The town did not change its behavior, but it began to change its attention. By the time Evelyn Hart reached the edge of Red Hollow that evening, word had already moved faster than horses, carried from mouth to mouth like dust in a windstorm. She felt it without needing to hear it. Doors that had once been merely closed were now deliberately shut, not out of urgency, but out of awareness that she was still outside them. The sky above the town was turning a pale copper, stretching long shadows across the wooden walkways, and Jack Rourke remained where he had been, half in light, half in hesitation, as if he belonged to neither. He watched Evelyn stop near an old water trough, her hand resting on the rim for only a moment before she pulled away, not because she was refused, but because she understood she would be. A woman across the street whispered something to another, both glancing at Evelyn with a practiced kind of certainty, the kind that required no proof anymore. Jack finally stepped forward again, not toward her directly, but toward the space between her and the town, as if testing whether that space had weight. He did not speak to her. Instead, he placed his hand briefly on the wooden edge of the trough, then withdrew it, as though confirming something only he could sense. Evelyn noticed him this time, not with surprise, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had stopped expecting kindness and was unsure what to do when it appeared in fragments. Her veil shifted slightly in the wind, revealing nothing fully, but suggesting enough that the town's imagination filled in the rest. A man near the general store shook his head as he passed Jack, muttering under his breath that some people never learned their place, though he did not specify who he meant, because in Red Hollow it was rarely necessary. The air between them thickened with unspoken conclusions, each person building a story without evidence, each story more certain than the last. Jack adjusted the silver watch on his vest, the only object on him that looked like it had ever been cared for, and for a brief moment he looked directly at Evelyn, not as a judgment, not as curiosity, but as if trying to understand what the town had already decided was not worth understanding. She did not return the gaze for long. Instead, she turned slightly away, as though the act of being seen was heavier than the act of being ignored. The sun lowered further, stretching the shadows of the buildings until they touched the middle of the street, and Red Hollow began its evening routine of watching without admitting it was watching. Jack remained still as people passed him, their eyes sliding off him like water off stone, but no one forgot he was there. And in that slow settling of evening, something unspoken began to form, not yet conflict, not yet change, but the first quiet resistance to a certainty the town had held for too long. The night did not arrive all at once in Red Hollow. It crept in like something reluctant to be seen, folding itself between rooftops and wooden porches until the entire town felt slightly smaller than it had been an hour before. Evelyn Hart stood near the edge of the main street, where the dirt road met the first stretch of open land, her silhouette thin against the fading copper sky. The veil over her face moved gently with the wind, but she did not adjust it, as if she had stopped believing it made any difference whether she was seen or not. Inside the town, lanterns began to flicker on one by one, and with each light that appeared, so did another layer of attention directed toward her. Not loud attention, not direct, but the kind that hides behind windows and half-open doors. Jack Rourke remained near the center of the street, not close enough to claim her presence and not far enough to disappear from it. He had not moved for several minutes, only shifted his weight once, as if the ground beneath him carried a memory he could not ignore. A group of men passed him on their way to the saloon, speaking in low voices that broke apart whenever Evelyn came into their peripheral view. One of them glanced at Jack and smirked faintly, not hostile, but amused in the way people are when they believe they already understand a situation better than those inside it. Evelyn stepped forward once, then stopped again, her hand brushing the edge of her veil without lifting it. The motion was small, but it carried something heavy, like a decision she had made many times before in different places. Jack finally broke his stillness and walked toward her, not quickly, not cautiously, but with the steady pace of someone who was no longer interested in the town's permission. He stopped at a distance that was neither polite nor intrusive, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Around them, Red Hollow continued its evening routine, but the rhythm of it felt slightly off, as if the town had forgotten a step in a dance it had practiced for years. Evelyn spoke first, her voice low and controlled, asking for nothing in particular, only acknowledging the space between them. Jack did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and adjusted the silver watch again, the motion precise, almost ritualistic, as if time itself required confirmation before he trusted it. When he finally spoke, it was not to explain anything, not to defend anything, but to state something simple enough that it did not need agreement. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her posture unchanged, though something in her shoulders eased slightly, like a burden she had been carrying without realizing how long it had been there. Behind them, a window closed quietly, then another, and another, not in protest, but in observation. The town was no longer reacting loudly. It was collecting impressions, storing them, unsure what to do with them, yet unwilling to discard them. Jack took a small step to the side, aligning himself more with Evelyn's position than with the center of the street, and in that subtle repositioning something shifted again, not visibly, but undeniably. Evelyn noticed it this time, not as kindness, not as rescue, but as acknowledgement, something she had not been granted in a long time. The air cooled as the last light left the sky, and Red Hollow settled into a silence that felt less certain than before, as if the town had begun, without permission, to reconsider the way it had been looking at the world. The first real change in Red Hollow did not come with words, it came with absence. Not absence of people, but absence of certainty, as if the town had begun to hesitate before finishing its own thoughts. Evelyn Hart noticed it first at dawn the next morning, when she stepped out from the small rented room Jack Rourke had quietly paid for without explanation. The wooden steps outside creaked under her weight, and for the first time since arriving, no one immediately looked away. Not because they accepted her, but because they were unsure how to continue ignoring her. The morning air was cold, dry, carrying the smell of dust, and smoke from chimneys still waking up. Jack stood a short distance down the street, leaning against a post, the silver watch catching faint light as he turned it slightly in his hand. He did not approach her right away. Instead, he watched the way she paused at the edge of the steps, as if testing whether the ground itself had changed overnight. A wagon rolled past slowly, and the driver looked at Evelyn longer than before, not with kindness, but with confusion, as though the story he had been told about her no longer fit what he was seeing. Evelyn pulled her veil tighter, not out of shame alone, but habit, a shield built from many towns that had spoken the same language without words. Jack finally walked forward when she reached the street, matching her pace without overtaking her. He did not offer direction or reassurance. He simply stayed close enough that the distance between them could not be used by others to define her alone. At Miller's general store, the bell above the door rang again as Evelyn entered, but this time the sound did not silence the room immediately. A clerk hesitated longer than before, his hands hovering over the counter before he spoke. The refusal that had once been automatic now carried a delay, and in that delay, something fragile formed. Jack remained outside, visible through the window, and several people inside noticed him watching, which made their own reactions less certain than they had been the day before. Evelyn asked for bread again, her voice unchanged, steady in a way that did not invite pity or challenge. The clerk looked at her, then briefly at Jack, then back at her coins. For a moment, the familiar pattern tried to repeat itself, but it fractured under its own hesitation. Outside, a man whispered something about outsiders and trouble, but his voice lacked conviction, as if he was repeating a sentence that no longer convinced even him. Jack adjusted his stance, not threatening, not defensive, simply present, and that presence carried more weight than any argument he could have spoken. When Evelyn received her purchase, she did not react with surprise. She only nodded once, a small movement that acknowledged not victory, but possibility. As she stepped back into the street, she noticed something else for the first time, a child watching her without being pulled away immediately. The mother did not speak, but her hand did not tighten either. Red Hollow was still the same town, the same buildings, the same dust, the same routines, yet something inside its behavior had loosened just enough to reveal how tightly it had been holding before. Jack walked beside Evelyn again as she moved down the street, the silver watch no longer emphasized, but still present, like a reminder that time was continuing whether the town was ready or not. And in the quiet space between their footsteps, Red Hollow found itself doing something unfamiliar. It began to observe without immediately deciding what it believed. By the fifth day in Red Hollow, uncertainty had become more visible than certainty, as if the town had started wearing its doubt in plain sight. Evelyn Hart no longer felt the same immediate rejection when she walked through the main street, but what replaced it was not acceptance, it was observation, careful and delayed, like a hand hovering above a door before deciding whether to knock. The veil over her face still remained, yet it no longer seemed to function as a shield, more like a question the town had not agreed how to answer. Jack Rourke stayed near her without claiming her space, moving through the town with the same quiet presence that made people lower their voices without knowing why. The silver watch on his vest caught light in fragments whenever he shifted, a small constant in a place that had begun to feel less constant itself. That morning, Evelyn passed Miller's general store again, and the bell above the door rang with the same sharpness as before, but the reaction inside was different. A clerk looked up too quickly, then looked away too slowly, as if trying to remember an old rule that no longer felt certain. No one refused her immediately. Instead, there was hesitation, a suspended moment where the town seemed to be negotiating with its own habits. Jack remained outside, not intervening, not directing, only existing within sight, and that alone was enough to alter the rhythm of the space. A group of men near the saloon spoke in low voices, their attention drifting toward Evelyn as she moved past, but their confidence was less sharp, more fragmented, like stories losing weight the more they were repeated. One of them mentioned her name, then stopped mid-sentence, as though realizing it no longer carried the certainty it once did. Evelyn did not respond to any of it. She continued walking, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, but something in her awareness had shifted. She no longer moved as if expecting rejection at every corner. She moved as if testing whether it would still arrive. Jack eventually matched her pace again, walking slightly behind and to the side, never in front, never blocking her path, as if respecting a line the town itself had drawn and was now forgetting how to maintain. Near the edge of the street, a woman paused while hanging laundry and watched Evelyn for several seconds longer than before, her hands stilling in mid-motion. No insult followed, no whisper, only silence that did not know what to do with itself. Even the children, who once reacted quickly and loudly, now observed from a distance without immediate instruction from adults. The change was not kindness, not yet, but it was no longer instinctive rejection either. It was something slower, more dangerous to the town's old order: reconsideration. Jack stopped briefly near the water trough where Evelyn had once been denied without words, and for the first time he did not place his hand on it. He only looked at it, as if measuring how memory occupied space. Evelyn noticed, but did not comment. Instead, she stood beside him, both of them facing a town that no longer behaved like a single voice, but like many voices unsure of which one should speak first. And in that fractured quiet, Red Hollow began to experience something it had never practiced before, the possibility that it might have been wrong without knowing it had ever decided anything at all. Red Hollow no longer reacted to Evelyn Hart with certainty, but uncertainty had not yet become kindness. It had become tension that lingered in every pause between actions. On the sixth morning, the town felt different in a way that could not be immediately named, like a familiar room where a single piece of furniture had been moved just enough to make people question their memory. Evelyn walked alone at first, the veil still covering her face, though she no longer gripped it as tightly, as if her own need for protection was slowly loosening without permission. The dirt road was colder under the early light, and the sound of her footsteps no longer triggered the immediate withdrawal of others. Instead, it triggered watching, quiet and extended, as though people were trying to confirm what kind of story she now belonged to. At Miller's General Store, the doorbell rang and lingered in the air longer than usual, and the clerk who once refused her without thought now hesitated before looking up, his expression caught between old habit and new uncertainty. When Evelyn placed her coins on the counter, there was a delay before they were taken, not refusal, not acceptance, but something suspended in between, like the town itself had forgotten which response was appropriate. Jack Rourke stood outside again, his presence unchanged, steady and quiet, the silver watch reflecting a thin line of morning light that moved whenever his hand shifted slightly. A group of townsmen gathered near the saloon later that day, their conversation lower than before, not because they feared being overheard, but because they were no longer fully confident in what they believed. One of them mentioned Evelyn again, but this time there was no laughter, only a trailing sentence that ended too soon, replaced by silence that no one rushed to fill. Evelyn passed them without stopping, her posture unchanged, though something in her awareness had sharpened, not into fear, but into recognition that the town was no longer one solid judgment, but many small, unstable ones. Jack followed at a distance that was neither protective nor distant, simply aligned with her movement through space, as if he had decided not to let the town define where she stood alone. Near the water trough, a moment repeated itself differently. A man approached it, saw her, hesitated, then turned away without speaking, leaving the action unfinished rather than denied. It was the first time Evelyn witnessed rejection fail to complete itself, and she did not react outwardly, but her hand lowered slightly from her veil, as if her body had registered a change before her mind fully accepted it. That afternoon, a small interaction occurred at the edge of the street where a shopkeeper offered her a simple task, not out of generosity, but out of confusion, as if the absence of refusal had created space that needed filling. Before Evelyn could answer, Jack stepped closer, not interrupting, not influencing, only standing within sight of both parties, and the shopkeeper's confidence dissolved into hesitation, the offer left unfinished and unresolved. Evelyn noticed that the decision had not been taken away from her, but the pressure around it had shifted, allowing her to remain without immediate consequence. As she walked away, she realized for the first time that Red Hollow was no longer deciding what she was, it was struggling to decide what it had been. And in that struggle, Something fragile and unfamiliar began to form beneath the dust and silence. The beginning of a town learning how to look without immediately turning away. By the seventh day, Red Hollow no longer felt like a town that rejected Evelyn Hart, nor like a town that accepted her. It had become something far more unstable, a place in the middle of rewriting its own instincts without knowing the language to finish the sentences it had begun. The air that morning was clear, cold, and unusually still, as if even the wind was listening before deciding how to move. Evelyn walked through the main street alone at first, her veil still in place, but no longer pulled tight, as if hiding had become less urgent and more habitual. Doors remained open longer behind her. Conversations did not stop as sharply when she passed. Instead, they softened, like voices unsure whether they still had authority over what they were saying. Jack Rourke was not far behind, as always, though now his presence felt less like an interruption and more like a fixed point the town had started to orient itself around. The silver watch at his vest caught the morning light in brief, quiet flashes, marking time in a place that had stopped trusting its own sense of order. Near Miller's General Store, Evelyn paused without being avoided immediately, and for the first time, the hesitation around her did not feel like rejection forming, but like memory being questioned. A man who had once turned away from her without thought now looked at her longer than necessary, then looked down at his own hands, as if unsure what rule he had been following before. The clerk inside the store spoke her greeting before she spoke hers, the words awkward but real, as though borrowed from a version of himself he was still learning how to use. Evelyn responded with a simple nod, her expression unchanged, but something in her stillness had shifted, not in confidence, but in awareness that the town was no longer reacting on instinct alone. Jack remained outside, watching without directing, his stance unchanged, yet the space around him seemed to influence the behavior of others without effort or demand. A group of townsmen gathered near the saloon again, but their conversation no longer carried certainty. Instead, it drifted between opinions that did not fully land. One of them mentioned Evelyn, but the name did not trigger laughter or dismissal. It only created a pause that no one immediately filled. Evelyn walked past them without altering her pace, but this time she felt the difference not in how they looked at her, but in how they struggled not to look away too quickly. A child standing near a hitching post pointed briefly, then lowered his hand when no adult corrected him, as if the reaction he expected had failed to arrive on time. Jack moved slightly closer when Evelyn reached the water trough again, the place where refusal had once been absolute, and now stood as a reminder of how quickly certainty could dissolve. No one approached it first. No one denied it. The trough simply existed without being assigned meaning, and that absence of instruction made the moment heavier than before. Evelyn stood beside it for a long moment, not touching it, but not turning away either, as if testing whether memory still held authority over present action. Jack did not speak, but his presence beside her created a balance that allowed silence to feel less like exclusion and more like observation. Across the street, a woman paused mid-step, watching, then continued walking without commentary, and that continuation itself felt like a small decision rather than an automatic one. Red Hollow was still the same in structure, the same buildings, the same dust, the same sun rising over dry wood and worn paths, but its reactions were no longer unified. Each moment now seemed to require thought before becoming behavior, and that delay was slowly changing the shape of the town more than any single act ever had. Evelyn finally turned away from the trough without looking back, and for the first time, the town did not define what that movement meant immediately. And in that gap between action and judgment, something unfamiliar took root, not acceptance, not rejection, but the beginning of a place learning how to see, without rushing to decide. The 8th morning in Red Hollow arrived with a strange kind of stillness, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something holding its breath. Evelyn Hart noticed it before she even stepped fully outside her rented room. The wooden floor beneath her boots no longer creaked with the same hostility, as if even the building had begun to forget why it once felt unwelcoming. She paused at the doorway, veil still resting over her face, and for a moment, she simply listened. No immediate whispers followed. No sudden withdrawal of presence from the street beyond. Instead, there was distance, cautious and stretched, like the town was observing her without committing to interpretation. Jack Rourke stood farther down the road than usual, not leaning, not waiting in a fixed posture, but simply existing within the space between buildings, his silver watch catching a soft reflection of morning light that seemed weaker than before. When Evelyn stepped onto the dirt road, something unusual happened. No one moved away immediately. A man carrying firewood adjusted his path slightly, but did not turn his head. A woman near a porch continued sweeping, her rhythm unchanged, though her eyes followed Evelyn for longer than habit would normally allow. It was not acceptance, not yet, but it was the absence of immediate rejection, and that absence carried more weight than any reaction had before. Jack began walking at the same pace as Evelyn without closing the distance between them, maintaining a quiet alignment that made it difficult for the town to isolate her presence as it once had. As they moved toward the center of Red Hollow, the atmosphere felt subtly altered, as if the town had entered a phase where its old rules no longer activated automatically. At Miller's General Store, the bell rang with its usual sharpness, but this time the sound did not command silence or withdrawal. Inside, the clerk hesitated for only a brief moment before acknowledging Evelyn, not with warmth, but with a lack of resistance that had not existed before. The exchange was simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried the strange pressure of something unfamiliar becoming routine. Jack remained outside, not interfering, but his presence near the window was noticed, and that awareness alone seemed to influence the tone inside the store. A customer who would have previously turned away instead shifted slightly to the side, creating space without being asked, as if the concept of exclusion required justification it no longer had ready. Evelyn took her purchase and stepped back into the street without lowering her gaze, though her posture remained controlled and steady. She was not transformed by the town's hesitation, but she was no longer shaped entirely by its certainty either. Further down the street, a conversation between two men paused mid-sentence when she passed, but it did not resume immediately after she moved on. The interruption lingered, unresolved, as though the town itself had begun to forget how to complete its own judgments quickly. Jack stopped briefly near the water trough again, his hand hovering above it for a moment before withdrawing without touch, as if acknowledging that even familiar objects no longer carried fixed meaning. Evelyn stood beside him, but did not wait for interpretation from anyone else. For the first time, she simply existed within the space without preparing for reaction. Around them, Red Hollow continued its slow, uncertain rhythm, no longer unified in its responses, no longer automatic in its decisions. And in that widening gap between impulse and action, the town found itself in unfamiliar territory. We're looking at something no longer guaranteed knowing what to do about it. The 9th day in Red Hollow did not begin with change, but with recognition of change already underway, as if the town had woken up aware that something inside its behavior no longer obeyed it fully. Evelyn Hart stepped out into the morning light and immediately felt the difference, not in how people treated her directly, but in how they hesitated before deciding whether to treat her at all. That hesitation had become a pattern now, stretching across faces, across doorways, across small, everyday movements that once carried certainty. Jack Rourke stood near the edge of the main street, no longer positioned as an observer from distance, but as someone whose presence had been quietly absorbed into the town's awareness. The silver watch on his vest reflected a thin strip of light, steady and unchanged, even as everything around him continued to lose its certainty. Evelyn walked forward without lowering her gaze, and for the first time, she noticed that no one immediately adjusted their path away from her. Instead, they adjusted after a delay, as though reacting to a thought rather than an instinct. A man carrying a sack of grain stepped aside too late to appear intentional, and that delay itself created a kind of discomfort that no one acknowledged aloud. Jack moved slightly behind her, matching her pace with precision, not guiding, not blocking, but existing in parallel, and that parallel presence seemed to complicate how others interpreted her movement. At Miller's General Store, the bell rang as it always had, but the reaction inside was no longer uniform. Some customers continued their conversations without interruption, while others paused halfway through sentences, unsure whether stopping was still required. The clerk behind the counter looked at Evelyn, then at Jack, then back at Evelyn, as if searching for the correct sequence of response that no longer felt obvious. When she placed her coins on the counter, they were taken without hesitation, and that simple absence of resistance created a quiet tension that lingered longer than any refusal ever had. Outside, Red Hollow continued to function, but not with its previous clarity. Conversations at the saloon entrance softened midstream when Evelyn passed, not stopping entirely, but losing direction as if the purpose of speaking had briefly dissolved. A child near the hitching post watched her without being pulled away, and the expected correction from an adult did not arrive immediately, instead arriving late enough to feel uncertain. Jack paused near the water trough again, his hand hovering above it for a moment before lowering without contact, as if even memory required reconsideration. Evelyn stood beside him, no longer anticipating rejection, but also not expecting acceptance, existing instead in a space where both outcomes had become equally delayed. Around them, the town's rhythm continued to fracture into individual choices rather than shared instinct, each person acting slightly later than expected, each reaction carrying the weight of thought instead of reflex. For the first time, Red Hollow did not feel like a place that knew what it believed, but like a place that was slowly realizing it had never truly agreed with itself in the first place. The 10th morning in Red Hollow arrived with a tension that no longer needed explanation, because it had already settled into the town's habits like dust settling into wood. Evelyn Hart stepped into the street and immediately felt it, not as resistance, but as a tension that had become uneven, as if the town was no longer sure how to distribute its gaze. Jack Rourke was already there, standing near the center of the road, not leaning, not waiting, but present in a way that made absence feel noticeable wherever he was not. The silver watch on his vest caught the morning light in short, controlled flashes, marking time that no longer seemed fully trusted by the people around him. Evelyn walked forward, and for the first time, she noticed that reactions did not arrive as a group. Instead, they arrived individually, delayed and inconsistent, like separate thoughts forming in separate minds. A man near the general store stepped aside, then stopped, then stepped further as if correcting himself mid-decision. A woman carrying water paused too long before choosing to continue walking, and that pause itself carried more meaning than any action she could have taken. Jack followed at a measured distance, not closing in, not falling back, but maintaining a steady alignment that seemed to anchor Evelyn's presence without defining it. At Miller's General Store, the bell rang and lingered in the air longer than usual, and the sound no longer triggered a shared reaction. Inside, one customer continued speaking while another stopped mid-sentence, and the lack of synchronization created a subtle disorder that no one addressed directly. The clerk looked at Evelyn, then at Jack, then at the coins on the counter, and for the first time his decision carried visible effort, as if each possible response had to be weighed against something unspoken. When he finally accepted the payment, there was no relief, only continuation, as though a rule had been followed without confidence in its meaning. Outside, the street did not return to its previous rhythm after she passed. Instead, it fractured further into isolated reactions. Two men near the saloon began a conversation, but one of them stopped listening halfway through, and the other continued speaking without noticing immediately. A child pointed toward Evelyn again, but this time the gesture was not corrected quickly, and the delay before correction made the gesture itself feel less certain. Jack paused near the water trough, his hand hovering above it longer than before, then lowering without contact, not because of hesitation, but because the act itself no longer required confirmation. Evelyn stood beside him without expectation, her posture steady, her attention no longer shaped by anticipation of rejection or acceptance, but by observation of change itself. Around them, Red Hollow no longer behaved as a single system. It had become a collection of individuals reacting at different speeds, each carrying their own version of what was appropriate, none fully aligned with the others. The town was still functioning, still speaking, still moving, but the shared certainty that once governed its responses had dissolved into fragments that no longer matched. Jack adjusted the silver watch once more, and for a brief moment, its reflection caught Evelyn's face without distortion. She did not turn away from it, and in that quiet alignment of reflection and presence, The town continued to lose its ability to decide instantly what anything meant, leaving behind something slower, more uncertain, and far more honest than it had ever been before. By the 11th day, Red Hollow no longer behaved like a town trying to decide what Evelyn Hart was. It behaved like a town trying to decide whether it still agreed with itself. The hesitation that had once been subtle had now grown into something visible in every interaction, as if each person carried a slightly different version of the same truth. Evelyn walked through the main street in the late morning light, her veil still in place, but no longer functioning as a barrier that defined her presence. Instead, it had become something almost symbolic, noticed but not used as a conclusion. Jack Rourke was already ahead of her this time, standing near the entrance of the saloon, not blocking it, not guarding it, but positioned in a way that made the space feel less owned by the town than before. The silver watch on his vest reflected the pale sun in brief flashes, steady and unchanged, a quiet contrast to the instability forming around him. Inside the saloon, voices carried differently now, no longer unified in tone or intention. Conversations overlapped without fully connecting, as if people were no longer certain which version of each other they were speaking to. Evelyn paused at the threshold, not because she expected rejection, but because she was observing something she had begun to understand. The town no longer reacted as one body. Jack did not look at her directly, but his presence shifted slightly, enough to acknowledge that she was there without assigning meaning to it. When Evelyn finally stepped inside, the sound of the room did not collapse into silence as it once would have. Instead, it fractured into partial attention. Some people noticed her immediately, others continued speaking, and a few stopped mid-action without deciding what to do next. The absence of a unified reaction created a tension that filled the room more completely than any single judgment had before. At the bar, a man began to speak about her, his voice confident at first, but as he continued, his certainty weakened, as if the words themselves were no longer supported by shared agreement. Jack stepped inside slowly, his movement unhurried, and took a position near the side of the room where he could be seen without dominating the space. No one challenged him directly, but several people adjusted their posture in response, unsure whether his presence was observation or implication. Evelyn did not respond to the man speaking about her. She simply turned slightly, enough to acknowledge that she was being discussed, but not enough to grant the conversation authority over her presence. The man faltered, his sentence breaking before it reached completion, and the silence that followed was not immediate, but delayed, as if the room itself was deciding whether agreement still existed. Jack finally spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a calm clarity that did not invite debate. He did not defend Evelyn in the way the town expected defense to sound. Instead, he spoke about seeing without deciding too quickly, about how a person could exist without being reduced to the first story told about them. His words did not stop the room, but they shifted it. People no longer looked at Evelyn as a fixed idea, but as something that could not be resolved through immediate judgment. A chair moved slightly, not in protest, but in adjustment. A glass was set down more carefully than before. Evelyn looked at Jack then, not with surprise, but with recognition that something had reached a point where silence was no longer passive. It was becoming intentional. Outside the saloon, the street remained still, but no longer indifferent. It was listening in fragments, each person carrying a different version of what they had just heard or failed to say. And in that fractured quiet, Red Hollow found itself closer than ever to a realization it had avoided since Evelyn first arrived, that certainty had been easier than understanding, and understanding would require a kind of patience the town had never practiced before. By the 12th day, Red Hollow no longer felt like a place reacting to Evelyn Hart, but like a place reacting to its own reflection in her presence. The town had begun to split into layers of hesitation, where every action carried at least two possible meanings, and neither could be confirmed quickly. Evelyn walked through the main street under a pale morning sky, her veil still covering her face, though it no longer carried the same weight of judgment it once did. Instead, it had become part of the landscape of uncertainty, noticed but no longer decisive. Jack Rourke stood near the center of town, not in front of anything, not behind anything, but within the space where attention naturally gathered without permission. The silver watch on his vest moved slightly as he adjusted his stance, catching light that felt thinner than before, as if even the sun was observing more carefully. Evelyn did not slow her pace when she passed the first group of townspeople. Instead of stepping away immediately, they hesitated, then adjusted only slightly, creating a strange imbalance in how space was shared. No one fully withdrew, and no one fully engaged. It was a pattern that had become increasingly common, as if the town had forgotten how to commit to a single interpretation of what it saw. At Miller's General Store, the bell rang, and the sound no longer triggered a unified response. Some people continued their conversations, others stopped halfway through sentences, and a few simply watched without deciding whether watching required explanation. Evelyn entered without resistance, but also without acknowledgement that anything had been resolved. Jack followed at a measured distance, not guiding, not defending, but present in a way that subtly influenced how others positioned themselves around him. When Evelyn placed her coins on the counter, the clerk took them without hesitation, but his eyes lingered longer than necessary, as if trying to confirm that the action still fit within an understandable pattern. Outside, the street continued to function, but its rhythm had become uneven. Conversations near the saloon no longer followed predictable turns. One voice would rise, then pause without conclusion, while another would respond without fully engaging with what had been said. The absence of synchronized reaction had become more noticeable than any disagreement. Jack stepped inside the saloon later that morning, and for the first time, the room did not shift immediately around his presence. Instead, it adjusted slowly, as if recognizing him as part of an ongoing uncertainty rather than an external force. Evelyn stood near the bar, not as a subject of discussion, but as someone whose presence no longer demanded immediate definition. When a man attempted to speak about her again, his words lost structure before they could fully form into accusation or certainty. He stopped, not because he was interrupted, but because the sentence itself no longer supported itself under scrutiny. Jack did not raise his voice. He did not correct or confront. Instead, he spoke in a steady tone about the difference between seeing and deciding, about how a person could exist beyond the first interpretation placed upon them. The room did not agree, but it also did not reject. It simply held the words without immediately assigning them a fixed position. Evelyn turned slightly toward Jack, not in response to protection, but in recognition that something had shifted from reaction to consideration. The people around them no longer shared a single response, but multiple incomplete ones, each person forming their own version of what was happening without certainty that it matched anyone else's. Outside, Red Hollow remained physically unchanged, its buildings still aligned, its roads still worn by the same patterns of use, but its sense of judgment had fractured into individual moments of hesitation. And in that fragmentation, the town found itself closer to understanding than it had ever been, not because it agreed, but because it could no longer decide instantly what disagreement meant. By the 13th day, Red Hollow no longer felt like a town waiting for something to happen, but like a town that had already been changed without fully agreeing on what the change meant. The streets were the same, the buildings unchanged, the dust still carried by the same slow wind, but the way people looked at each other had shifted into something quieter and more deliberate. Evelyn Hart stood at the edge of the main street in the early morning light, her veil no longer held in place with the same urgency, resting more loosely now as if its meaning had softened over time rather than disappeared. She did not move immediately. For the first time since arriving, there was no pressure from the town to define her presence, no immediate reaction that forced her into a role. Jack Rourke stood several yards away, as he had so often before, but the space between them no longer felt like distance imposed by the town. It felt like space that could exist without explanation. The silver watch on his vest caught the morning sun in a calm, steady reflection, marking time that no longer seemed to belong to certainty or judgment, but to something slower and more human. Around them, Red Hollow continued its morning routines, but even those routines carried a noticeable softness. People moved without urgency to categorize what they saw. Conversations began without the same need to conclude quickly. When Evelyn finally walked forward, no one stepped aside in reaction, and no one stepped forward in judgment. Instead, they simply allowed her to pass, as if the act of deciding what she was had quietly lost its necessity. At Miller's General Store, the bell rang once again, but the sound no longer divided the room into silence and speech. It simply marked her arrival. Inside, the clerk greeted her with a simple acknowledgement, not as a statement of change, but as a continuation of something that no longer required correction. Evelyn placed her coins on the counter, and they were accepted without hesitation, without performance, without the weight of interpretation. Jack entered after her, and this time no one turned to measure his presence against expectation. He simply stood where he stood, part of the room rather than an influence upon it. Later that morning, Evelyn and Jack stood near the water trough, the same place where judgment had once felt absolute, and now felt only like memory without authority. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was no need to define what had already been understood through repetition rather than explanation. Around them, Red Hollow continued to exist, but it no longer reacted as a single voice. It had become a place of individual awareness, where each person carried their own version of understanding without forcing it onto others. That fragmentation no longer felt like confusion. It felt like space. Evelyn finally turned slightly toward the road beyond the town, not as an escape, not as a rejection, but as a recognition that she could remain or leave without either choice defining her worth. Jack adjusted the silver watch one last time, then let his hand fall naturally to his side, as if even time itself no longer required his correction. No one called after her. No one stopped her. And no one needed to. As she walked forward, Red Hollow did not claim her, and it did not erase her. It simply allowed her to exist without definition, and in that quiet allowance, the town itself learned something it had never known before, that understanding does not always arrive as agreement, but sometimes as the willingness to stop deciding too quickly. And in that stillness, both the town and the people within it continued forward, no longer as one voice, but as many, finally able to coexist without needing to become the same.